Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for being here this morning. My name is Ryan Jamboretz. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Videology. We are an ad tech company based in the US, but have a large presence here in Europe. I'm actually based here myself. So my hope today is to give you an introduction and some observations about the TV market, specifically how TV and video are converging. Hopefully, given the fact that I'm an American living in London and have spent about the last 8 to 10 years working in parts of the advanced, programmatic, and every other kind of derivation of the name of advanced television advertising, I can give you some perspective. In terms of what I'll touch on today, and I thought Eleni's comments about kind of the balance between technology and media and industry was really great, because actually that's a lot of the way we think about the world and a lot of the way that our customers in Europe as well as in North America, even in places like Asia and Australia, are starting to think about the world. And one of the things I'll come back to a few times is, despite the fact that in many markets around the world, everything is unique and everything is different, one of the things we're seeing more and more is the commonality of the problem that's out there. And the commonality of the problem in terms of how that natural balance in the television business between content distribution and monetization is being challenged at times, and actually is a position of strength for the core constituents in the industry that I actually think, and having heard a lot of the comments over the last couple of days, think many in this room are actually missing out. So we'll come back to that. So just to give you a quick primer on who Videology is. Videology is a company of about 400 people based in about 28 countries around the world. Truth of what we really are, Videology is a video specialist, as the name would suggest. We're a company that was built on the premise that TV and video would converge. An idea that I would argue many in this room probably had 8 to 10 years ago, as you saw broadband propagate, as you saw technology coming. The idea that television and video were going to come together was not in and of itself that original. How you attack that problem and how you solve that problem is what is quite original about how we've approached things. And I'll come back to that as we go, but Eleni talked about it before in terms of kind of that convergence of television going into digital and digital going into television. We are card-carrying members of the TV fan club at Videology. We actually, unlike most technology companies are built on the premise of disruption. The idea that you are coming in to destroy the value chain and collect the pieces in a new way that will produce value for you. We actually have taken a very different view since the start of this. We've actually taken the view that television is a wonderful thing. It's the best reach mechanism created to date in media. It was actually a dinner we had last night with Erwin Gottlieb, the chairman of Group M, and Steve King, the CEO of Publicis Media. And they described it perfectly as the least worst option in media. TV remains the best reach mechanism or the least worst relative to the others that you can go for. So as we talk about things, you'll hear me comment, Videology is not an omni-channel technology. We are not trying to solve every problem in media. We do believe the problems for TV and video converging are very unique, and the market dynamics are very different than what Google would apply in terms of its religion about search, or that other companies would apply in terms of how real-time bidding and other mechanisms come to the table. It's an idea that we believe is getting a lot of traction as well. And it's an idea that originally started with major customers of ours like WPP and Publicis and Omnicom, the major media buying organizations around the world. And it's an idea that actually the distributor side of the world and the supply side of the world have woken up to over the last 2 to 3 years. So our customer relationships have morphed quite dramatically over the last few years. So people like Mike Welch from AT&T, Adam Gaynor, who you saw earlier, the people from Sky here in the UK and across Europe have become customers because this notion of how do you attack this convergence problem in a way that elevates and unifies beyond legacy technologies. Legacy tech, and I think a lot of us know this, television was built on the notion of content, using content as a proxy for an audience. Not to be insanely stereotypic here, but if I want to reach women to sell Diet Coke, I'm going to buy daytime television soap opera type program. The opposite extreme, if I want to reach men to sell beer, I'm going to sell it on the NFL or Premiership. What we're finding now and more and more in the work that we're doing is how do you take those legacy systems that were built upon delivering ads or delivering content into each one of those silos of distribution and elevating it and unifying it. Unifying it most often with first-party data, sometimes with second and third-party data, but as Adam said, the data that comes in the form of first-party set-top box data, first-party registration data is gold dust. And we're seeing that being utilized by some of the more progressive clients we have around the world. This is a look at the US TV market versus a number of the other key markets around the world. And I think one of the things that I want to make very clear, despite kind of the, what's the famous Mark Twain quote? The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. We hold the same belief to be true about television. Television is softened in some of the key markets around the world by, what I would argue is within the margin of error. And I think we've all heard many times over the course of the last 2 days that it's not that television has declined. It's not that content consumption has declined. It's not that content production budgets haven't increased massively. The difference is when you measure it in the old school linear form of television, that has softened slightly. But television is much greater than that. We all know, and we've heard a lot of discussion over the last couple of days about how television is many things, and the definitions are quite important. I actually think this gets to the heart of the conversation that Lenny teed up earlier, which is, are you looking at the world as a TV out world, or are you looking at it as a digital in world? So if your center of gravity is Google, is Facebook, is a traditional Silicon Valley company, you look at the world from the outside in. You look at the world as television is an antiquated business that trades amongst a small cabal of people that doesn't really follow the norms of an auction-based pricing model. You want the television world to coalesce around the way Google Search or Google AdWords is working. We have a very different religion. Our religion is probably more consistent with people like NBC or ITV or Sky or Dish, which look at the world and say, despite the fact that linear TV has softened, it still makes up 62% of all consumption. And to actually accomplish and actually tackle the problem of how you were going to actually step into that converged world, you need to look at the world and look at the technology solutions that actually traverse that whole onion, as we like to call it. It's the notion that you need to think of the world and you need to think of progressing into this more than what's my Snapchat strategy? What's my, set-top box delivery strategy? Those things are absolutely important. They're absolutely necessary. The legacy technologies that enable every one of those things are absolutely critical for people to do what we do. But ultimately, we believe it needs to be looked at as a TV out world. Why is that important for TV, and I think for many of the guys in the room today? Well, growth is slow. I think we know that TV is a business, and this is true from what we've seen in probably the top 8 to 10 TV markets around the world where we operate. TV is going to grow as a core function about at the rate of GDP growth. And given we're now in a slow economic growth period, which is anticipated to continue for many decades to come, the growth is coming from new areas. The growth is coming from, be it you call it addressable advertising or you call it programmatic television. This is a US chart that looks at what in 2016 was 1% of the TV market moving up to 6 to 8% by 2018. This is where the growth is coming. Being able to tackle that in a way that's consistent with that core epicenter of your business is where we're helping our customers. This slide, I think, actually highlights why this is becoming important. So going back to the analogy of television being the least worst thing there is. This slide on the left looks at the time spent on devices. Not a surprise. I think we've all seen that the consumption on core television versus different devices, the mix is changing. If you look to the right, this is where this problem comes home to roost for someone like Adam who's selling media or someone like Steve King who's buying media. And that is, if you look at what the reach was of the top programs 15, 20 years ago, you would see that the ability to achieve high levels of reach and cover a massive amount of a certain population of a certain country were achievable with television alone. And what you see more and more every year is the amount of reach delivered by the highest rated program has declined year on year on year. And that is just a function of fragmentation, and it's a function of the fact that people as consumers have more selection of content, more selection of distribution choices. These are trends that, I think if any logical person looks at these things, I don't think that you could argue that these trends are going to reverse themselves anytime soon. So this just actually gives you one look at a prime time example in North America. So this is a US 30-second TV spot, 30-second TV program, 30-minute TV program running, and it shows the consumption of that actual content. And it shows you that if you actually start to look at the world more broadly, you need to understand how your technology solutions and how your selling strategies are actually going to go across all of those things. And some of that comes down to reporting. There's been a lot of discussion this week about Barb, Nielsen, the way they're reporting on these things so that it can be bought and transacted with a currency that reflects these things. But ultimately, you need to understand that when we're going into the market, either the buy side or the sell side, you're dealing with a very different dynamic than you were in 2000 when everything was going through a primetime television distribution point. That change in consumption causes problems. And I think a lot of us have seen those problems. The problems are many, right? You can talk about new competition, fragmented audiences. One of the problems that you see in markets like the US and even the UK is unmonetized inventory. Siloed ad tech stacks, the notion that you have to have expertise in each one of these new disciplines is critical. Literally, unless you can deliver things, content and or the monetization at the right time to the right box, nothing happens. And until that is cracked, and this is, I think, one of the more inspired things that you see is companies like Dish, AT&T, WPP going out and buying a company like NVIDIA Technologies, a great company with expertise in the set-top box, the ability to deliver addressability, to be that ad-serving technology that puts that ad there. The same is true of great companies like Uyala and Freewheel in the digital space. The ability to ad serve without that technology, the ability to do the stuff in terms of yield optimization and audience-based targeting to unify those things is not possible. I also wanted to use this chart to talk about the competitive thing, because I think I have a slightly different view of the competitive discussion. I think we've heard a lot throughout the course of yesterday, today, my dinner last night, which is, it's a comment I call kind of the traditional foes with new clothes on and the barbarians at the gate. And so whether you're in the UK market or the French market or the US market, and you're a media seller or even a media buyer, the idea that your competitors are getting smarter, are embracing technology, or starting to embrace technology, as Eleni said, is a challenge. Everyone, though, seems to focus, I would argue, a lot more on the barbarians at the gate. Google, Facebook, in the US, even Verizon increasingly. They're looking at these companies and saying, they're coming, they're working from the outside of that onion in. And how do we combat that? How do we defend our territory? Television is a very strong business. The biggest buyers of media, the biggest brands of media who buy media, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, are massive fans of television. They are massive fans of television's ability to communicate. They are massive fans and understand that television moves product off shelves. So for us, I look at Google, I look at Facebook, I look at Apple and Amazon as well. They are new to the market, they are threats, but I think you need to kind of look inside and say, if you look at the best companies around the world, the ones who are bleeding edge innovators, I'd argue people like AT&T, people like Sky, people like Dish are doing this stuff, they're looking at what they have and putting a product forward which is very proactive. They're putting a product forward where they're either building it internally or partnering with others and going forward and saying there is an alternative which meets the different needs of the TV market, which isn't based on the lowest common denominator and auction-based pricing, which actually trades in a way that their counterparties want to trade with them, and ultimately I think is highly defensible. Going back to, I think you need to look at the approach that different people take to this problem. And use Google, use Facebook. Those companies have a religion about real-time bidding. They have a religion about markets that are defined by an oversupply of content and inventory. TV is very different. TV is sold out in many markets. Content quality is hugely important. Brand marketers love it versus performance marketers. The dynamics of those markets are very different. To think that the TV market is going to be blown apart and the pieces gathered by two companies in Silicon Valley just because they set up an auction, I think is actually, to be quite blunt, naive. I think there is a tremendous amount of value in the assets, be it the data, be it the distribution, and a high level of content that people in this room have that really needs to be leveraged. Okay, so how does that relate to a guy named Ryan and a company named Videology? So Videology was built on, and I guess if you go back to the quintessential cliched startup slide on a napkin, on a piece of paper scratched out, Videology was based on the central premise that TV was different. That TV and video digitizing and converging would happen as many thought, but the approach you had to take needed to be different. And that really gets down to the market dynamics. How do you build something for TV that lives by the rules and the norms of TV? Things where guaranteed delivery, fixed price, fixed volume are the norm. The notion that you could underdeliver or overdeliver campaigns in television means make goods, not an apology call to a customer. In markets like Japan where we work, you literally have to pay 3 times the value of the campaign if you underdeliver campaigns. So you get very good very quickly at forecasting, taking reservations, delivering against very complex audiences across all these devices. And if you don't, you fail. And this is actually one of the reasons why I speak with a very bullish belief about the TV space, where you guys are going, where companies like mine are participating. This is the golden age of television, from all of the new sources of content, all of the new innovation going on. For us, this is a dream scenario. It's the opportunity to kind of step in and actually help the people who control the market really do things in a different way. So how do we do it? So I use the analogy is oftentimes the best way to describe what we do, and the way I describe it is kind of a plane and a flight path. We talked earlier about the balance between data, media, and technology. This is kind of my version of Eleni's kind of three-part slide, but we look at data and media as inputs. So whether it is data that comes from one of our supply-side customers who have registration data or set-top box data, or whether it's a third-party data source, or whether it's a customer's customer list, a Procter & Gamble customer list. For us, it's an input. Media is the same thing. For the most part, when we talk about media, we're not talking about exchange-based media, real-time bidding-based media. We're talking about fixed price, fixed volume, high-quality, television-quality content. Whether it's linear television, or whether it's an addressable form of linear television, or whether it's the digital form of that same content running on IP-based devices. For us, it's an input. And ultimately, our flight, the analogy of the flight plan, it's objective-based planning. The idea that if you're flying a plane, you got to decide whether you're flying from Heathrow to Tokyo or Heathrow to LA, right? The second part of it is the allocation. The fact that we are actually flying probably on any given day 4,000 to 5,000 flights to 4,000 to 5,000 different locations, and how do you actually allocate all of the runways, all of the airports, all of the seats. The technology we've developed is usually used by people like DHL and FedEx and American Airlines versus people who have built bidding technologies. And finally, it's about automated optimization. How do you develop a technology that doesn't require a tremendous amount of people to be pulling levers and turning knobs? A lot of the digital world is actually highly manual, and it's had to be highly manual. What we've developed is a system that effectively allows that system to course correct as you're flying from Heathrow to LA and you hit headwinds, as there's an ice storm you have to traverse around. How do you make sure that the rest of those planes aren't thrown completely off kilter? How do you make sure that all of the rest of those planes land at the right place at the right time? Ultimately, that is a problem which comes down for major media buyers like WPP and publicists, as well as for major media sellers and distributors. It's the notion of how do you, on the advertising side, use such a system to drive ROI? Whatever your measure of ROI is, whether it's sales of products off shelves, or whether it's consumption or brand ratings. And then to the supply side of it, it really comes down to yield. And I am, just to give the example, if I am a media seller like NBC or ITV, I have a high quality asset, which is highly scarce. Unlike the display space, which is largely infinite with supply, this stuff is scarce and it's in demand and it's premium priced. Any wastage, any inability you have to yield manage is money left on the table. So that's where the problem really gets applied for guys like this. And this is becoming increasingly a problem, because when you're doing it with a core linear television business, you can do it with boxes on a whiteboard. When you start to add in digital, when you start to add in multiple digital devices, when you start to look at that onion and try to traverse across the whole thing, you better have something a lot better than a few people pulling knobs. So for the architecture and kind of the techie guys in the room, this kind of gives a perspective on what we do. And I'll try to kind of point out as we go. But ultimately, our system is represented by the massive orange box, which basically defines us as controlling the world and trying to do everything for everyone. The reality is what we do is we act as an intelligence system. We are a yield management intelligence system for people who have a number of different devices down at the bottom, who have experts at delivering into each one of those devices, but wants to step forward into how do you yield optimize and how do you develop audience-based techniques and selling across those. And so for us, we said it earlier, it's a matter of inputs: data, first-party and third-party data, and media. And it's the ability to take those two things and combine them, where we have customers around the world who are using this to step forward. So people like Jeff and Sky, people like AT&T, people like Fox, people like Yahoo Japan are using these type of approaches to elevate above what their kind of legacy systems have done. And what it's doing is it's actually helping them step into new money. So that growth, that 1% up to 8% growth in terms of programmatic, those guys are capturing a disproportionate amount of it. They're finding that it's the way to actually move the needle on their sales, their stock price, and ultimately bring them in kind of the next generation. And I think Adam said it perfectly well. These guys are, crawl, walking, and running. They're, our most advanced clients are probably in the advanced walking stage now, I'd call it. And the next stage is really lighting up the linear yield optimization as well. And so we're seeing that play out kind of concurrently. But it kind of goes back to what I said when we started, which was despite the fact that the market in Spain or the market in France and the market in the US or Canada are different and they trade differently and they're different personalities, that problem solved by that architectural diagram is bizarrely similar in a lot of these places. So it's one of those things that is, we are going to new markets, we're constantly having very similar conversations. We had the luxury last night of pulling together a group of our customers from around the world to have a chat about what our challenges are. And the thing that came back time and time again was the challenges were very similar. People had different ideas, were attacking them in a different way. But ultimately, that's kind of the problem that I see for you guys in an industry and the role that someone like a Videology is playing. The next several years should be a pretty fascinating time. It obviously is a time of opportunity and a time of fear and risk, which tends to be, in my personal opinion, when a lot of stuff gets done. So, I just wanted to, that's all I had for today. I just wanted to say thank you for having me first. It's a great event. Thanks to Justin and everyone for having us here. And if there are any questions, I can take questions.
I think we have time maybe for one question. You're going to be here for the break?
Yeah, I'm here the rest of the day. I'm here. Yeah, so please grab me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.